So first I'd like to acknowledge my co-author on this. Kelly Helm-Smith is the Assistant Director at the Drought Mitigation Center, and she didn't come down, but she's had an interest on drought impacts for a very long time, and she's also been with the center since 1995, so a lot of collective experience on sort of the drought impacts on the social side. What do we mean by drought impact? Well, just to put us on the same page here, we call it an observable loss or change that occurred at a specific place or time because of drought. You know, this picture here, I think might be from Cimarron County in Oklahoma, the Panhandle area. Impacts are the face of drought. They take a lot of different forms, and there's lags between what we first see, sort of the ecological, agricultural level versus what we see later on through reduced water supply and hydrological drought. So why track these impacts? Well, because they help us understand that relationship between the physical and social realm. You know, we're living on the land. We need that land to produce food, give us water to drink. Planning is a big one to understand changing conditions. I was just kind of talking about that fluid dynamic between what is a drought now and the impacts, what sort of physical drought does it take to produce that impact versus what it took to make that same impact back in the 50s or your last drought or the drought of record, whatever the case may be, the Dust Bowl years. And I think there's already some early evidence showing us that why are we seeing such bad impacts on D2 that people would normally associate with like a D3 or D4, and I think that's part of that fluid dynamic there. And then validation that you just brought up in the last question, that we can use the impacts to also help validate our models and our satellite data. You know, if we had good data from ARS or other groups that have like transect data, biomass clipping data, that can be used to validate these sorts of products. From like the long-term ecological research centers, we would take any of it to be a sanity check and sort of be eyes and ears on the ground for us. So we can do this by sector. We've identified 9 sectors that we spell out in the Drought Impact Reporter. There's been some interesting and really welcomed forms of data feed from impact off the ground that have become available over just the last year. One of them is called this Real-Time Condition Monitoring Network, and it's produced out of the Carolinas. We were able to plot this in the GIS again and overlay it with the physical data. So now we can start to say, if there's white areas on the map, are those impacts lingering from the last drought, like this region? Did it really truly recover from the drought of 3 to 4 or 5 years ago? Maybe you got back up on the fence. It just takes a little ripple and another drought to come by to knock you back off the fence again pretty quickly, much more quickly than the last drought, because the resilience isn't there. That system has been exposed and is vulnerable. So we can look at domestic wells and things that might not be monitored as systematically by state agencies as the state networks are concerned. You know, not the water utilities, but the private homeowner wells. This was a big problem in California with that drought. You know, these wells were dried up, these people were without water, but they weren't technically being monitored within the state system. So they weren't even aware of how some of the communities were being impacted. So this is one of the ways we can do that, is this sort of citizen science, if you will, to some degree. In the agricultural sector, obviously we've got a lot of great information available through RMA, FSA, NRCS, all of the agencies within USDA. NASA is another one that we look at. Can we validate? But it's sort of post or retrospectively. How can we better operationally in real time get impacts into the equation? Because that's where we truly need to validate the data. So we know we're not crying wolf too soon. We're not calling the dogs off too early when we're coming out of drought. So we got to watch that going in and coming out of drought. You know, RMA's got the indemnity data again. Typically, though, that's after the loss. What about during the evolution of the drought? So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the tools that might be ways of you to get input into us in real time. Of course, on the water and energy sector, whether it's hydropower, whether it's navigation, whether it's tourism, that's a whole other set of level of data. Whether it's the Texas Water Development Board, whether it's the Corps of Engineers or the Bureau of Reclamation, that data all has a place in validating the data that goes into the Drought Monitor. As I mentioned earlier, every state might have a different way of doing it. You guys, I think, with that passage of Senate Bill 1 about, 10, 15 years ago, the utilities and the drought planning that's gone into place, there are very few states that are at that level of detail for sort of planning for drought at the water utility level. So it's really hit or miss, it's shotgun approach. And I already mentioned the issue in California where they weren't monitoring the private wells, and that consisted of a lot of wells that weren't on the utility systems. Public health's another big one. We're seeing this a lot. We're trying to now correlate it. We're working, several on my team are working with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to look at, can we correlate droughts to increased respiratory illness, Zika, West Nile, things of that nature, other health-related problems. This is a bigger, and then there's the whole mental health issue. Suicides rocket up through drought periods when people are losing ranches or farms that have been in the family since, for over 100 years in some cases. It's traumatic. It's a traumatic thing. And again, it's the way drought works. It sort of permeates in through the culture of a community. So it doesn't matter to me that it's not like a huge piece of the GDP if it's the LDP, the local domestic product, is being impacted. In some of these communities, droughts are real crippling. And y'all have seen plenty of these dust storms over the last few years. Tourism and recreation is another big one. In most states, that's one of it's always usually typically in the top 3 economic drivers. Depends on the state, if it's ag, whether it's business, or if it's tourism. But many states, it's going to be right up there. It's a big deal when people can't go out and be on the water and do what they do with the water. And in this example, this is for skiing in the Pacific Northwest, but it could have just as easily shown boating or other sort of activities and fishing and hunting and everything else that occurs in a locale like here in Texas. Endangered species is another one, of course, that's in the game that wasn't there maybe when you were dealing with the drought of the 50s that we do have to be aware of now. We get input into some of our interfaces, and I'm going to show you that in just a minute. The Drought Impact Reporter, that's what that DIR is, where someone was giving us an example of reporting in some invasion of cheatgrass, and how is there a way that they could geotag that with their photo on the ground and import it into our database, and we do now allow for that to happen. So we take impact from the field on that. We take input, I should say. So what we're trying to do is find, it's a little different ballgame than just recording precipitation and temperature. What we're trying to do is tap into these social networks of where people are talking and communicating about how they're being impacted by drought. And one of those is social media. So we had a really big flash drought, big blow up of drought last year in the high plains, the Dakotas, eastern Montana, northeastern Wyoming, a little bit down into Nebraska. And this was an organic thing where they had this hashtag Drought 17. And people were just, hundreds of people were just reporting in impacts. It wasn't required of them, it wasn't mandated on them. They were trying to get their voice heard of how they were suffering on the ground. And so that's one way. Now there's this other group called the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. Is anyone in the room here familiar with CocoRa's? Got a handful, but not a lot. So this is a volunteer network of citizen scientists or professionals like yourself that have a 4-inch rain gauge, but it's not just rain. They can also, there's a little drought input that you can do within the interface for CocoRa's. That actually comes into our national database. I don't know if you know that for those of you that work through the CocoRa's network. So how can we get that out there and integrate that more from these other networks? Social media, tweets, etc. So this is what the interface looks like if you come in today. It is going through some revisions to hopefully streamline it and make it even more better and more efficient, especially that entering a user input. It's called Submit a Report. Anybody can come in and submit a report. But all the reports that come into the database we have a moderator. She's a very dedicated gal, Denise. That's what she does almost every day, day in, day out, every day of the year. She works on drought impacts. She It's just yeoman work, it's awesome work. We have 66,000 reports from the media in that database now, and we started in 2005, and we have approaching 25,000 impacts. She's entered probably 90% of those impacts herself over her career here at the center over the last 13 years. So it's searchable by time, place, scale, category, term. This interface will let you do that. We're trying to develop this baseline of drought, so this is really important. It's something that through the support of USDA and Drought.gov at night is that we're able to keep going. Just some examples. I mentioned that hashtag Drought 17 last year. This was some of the monitoring we were doing through this is a company called Meltwater. They kind of monitor social media, and they monitor newspaper reports, and we subscribe to that, and then we do key searches for drought-related terminology. And so this is one way we can do that. It's sort of an automated fashion, but you get hundreds or thousands of these. It becomes very daunting to get those into the database, but Denise goes through all of them. This was user reports. These are actually people just coming in. These are state or federal personnel. They could be ranchers, they could be farmers, they could just be Georgian citizen, doesn't matter. It comes to the moderator, and if it's deemed truly an impact, it gets put into the database. So she has to sort of validate that on the fly. In CocoRa's in 2017, this was a number of CocoRa's reports through their constituents. And then we kind of tracked, when did those impacts occur at the various D0 through D4 levels. And we start now to associate the various drought severity categories with certain impacts to anticipate impacts in the future. And how could a state respond to that, or how could a federal agency respond to that? This was for Butte County only. So that's quite a few for we're just talking one county. Here's that hashtag Drought 17 tweets I talked about earlier. And this was sort of the region impacted by that sort of drought and forage conditions, and then you had some fires break out as a result of that too. This is where we're working to try to harness and get more of that information in front of the authors. Can we bring this into a GIS? Can we scrub it or scrape it, pull it in, and let them see that, okay, they haven't had rain, but what does that really mean? And I'll just stop with that. Kind of caught us up on time, because I know we want to hear from our FSA partners. Any questions about that? So the bottom line is anyone can enter a report. It does go to a moderator. We want to keep the UFO things out of there and stuff like that. But especially in this part. And I've done drought workshops just like this in Roswell. So yeah. I've been to the museum in Roswell. Yeah. So any quick questions, and then we'll have time at the end to answer more if we got Brian. Comment.
We last year at this exact same time we were up in South Dakota with one of the Drought Monitor forums going on, and we had someone from an FSA office in the audience, and she's like, with impacts, I do all this information for my regular duties. Is there a way that we can incorporate some of those regular office duties of getting that data pushed into this tool without extra steps by you all? So something to think about with that. I know some of you are doing these activities on a regular basis, but if we could tap into that as well.
Yes, so several years ago, we invested in several, the Soil and Climate Analytical Network systems.
Sensors in the ground?
Yes,
yeah.
And so we're monitoring soil moisture, temperature, 40, 60, 65 inches.
Yeah, right.
Wind, all that sort of thing. So so how can we network with y'all to get that information?
I would start with,
I know Texas Tech has got several of those. A&M system. I mean, they're all over the state.
So depending on, for example, the soil I know is already logged in there because we worked with Stu Fire, who used to be at Texas A&M. They're building a national database of all the state mesonettes and the federal networks. So not only the scan sites, but then like the network you're talking about, whether it's a state or university run or regional climate center run. But I would start on, if that data is getting in front, do you have derivative products now that are coming out of the data from that network? Because that's probably not very old, right?
No.
But the reason that's important, we can't do long-term historical ranking percentiles, but we use it to sort of do the operational and the ground truthing of models and satellite data right now. That data can still help us do that, even if we don't have 50 years, because it's a ground truth right now. So I would work to get that in front of John Nielsen-Gammon, the state climatologist at A&M, and make sure that he's aware of that, and can he use that to, he's got this SPI gridded model sort of thing that really drives a lot of his analysis. I would hope that he would be willing to
we all
bring your
work with
data in.
him and USDA as well already.
If it gets to him, it's getting to us, it's getting to Brian. Because they contribute every Monday, they have their call every Monday. The authors typically sit in on it. I know I used to.
It's Tuesday now.
It's Tuesday now. And then that gets in front of the authors, one way or the other. So
Good.
Good, great, thank you. We want to move to our...
Yeah, let's-